Hi, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, and this is my weekly edition of The War on Misinformation. This week I'd like to focus on media coverage of a report published recently by the OECD, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, based in Paris. And it's every 12 or 18 months it does a report on the Australian economy, which also touches on our major housing markets. And they've published their latest report, and overall it's a very positive synopsis of our economy. It says some fairly strong and positive things about the state of the Australian economy, which is likely to continue, it says. And it says some fairly mild and benign things about the property markets in our bigger cities. But the media coverage has been a mass of screaming negatives, the most alarmist headlines that you could possibly imagine. The world is about to end for Australian real estate, according to the headlines, all based on this report, which really has been grossly misrepresented by major media coverage. So firstly, I want to start with about the only media outlet which actually did calm, rational, fair, balanced and reasonable coverage of this report, and that's the Property Observer website, which I write a column for once a week. But their headline on its report on the OECD report on the Australian economy said, "Property market on track for soft landing in 2019. But regulators should be prepared in case of a hard landing," says the OECD. Now that's actually quite a reasonable synopsis of what the report actually said. So the group said that they believe that the Australian property market, what they call the Australian property market, I always have an objection when people treat Australia as a single market, because we've got so many scenarios playing out at the moment, and most of what media is getting excited about and writing all the negative headlines is about Sydney. But they're treating Sydney as Australia, and they're extrapolating that situation into headlines that talk about prices tumbling across the country, which simply isn't true. And I think we all know it's not true, particularly those of you who live outside of Sydney, the 20 million or so Australians who don't live in Sydney. But anyway, as Property Observer in its report observed, the OECD in its report said that the market in Australia is on track for a soft landing. The agency suggested that Australia's long span of economic growth, which is 27 consecutive years of growth, is likely to continue. It commented that life in Australia is good with high levels of well-being, including health and education. It said the robust economic growth is set to continue. And then it commented at some point on the property market, saying that all the data is pointing to the likelihood of a pretty calm outcome for the major property markets, a soft landing, but at the same time, if they thought it was prudent for the Australian government to consider the possibility that something more than a soft landing would happen, and that they should prepare for that. Okay, so that's a reasonable report and headline on what the OECD did, but most of the headlines were just dreadful. Here's one that says, "House price collapse would pressure the whole economy, warns OECD. Australian regulators should be drafting contingency plans for a severe collapse in house prices with a hard landing looming as a key risk." The OECD is warning. Well, actually, no, they didn't say that. They didn't say that at all. That was not the content of the report, nor was it the intent. That's a misrepresentation by, in this case, ABC News, which is probably the media outlet that has the worst, the most consistently bad coverage of the housing market and the building industry. They're just dreadful. I don't know why they've adopted this stance, but they have. And everything they do on the real estate market is just a screaming negative, and quite dishonestly so. Later in their report, they revealed the real content of the OECD report, which says house prices have fallen, although only gradually, since late last year. The current trajectory would suggest a soft landing, but some risk of a hard landing remains. Well, that's what they said. Now, that's a fairly benign commentary, and that does not in any way justify this outrageously negative headline that the ABC chose to put on top of its story, which says that Australian regulators have to be drafting contingency plans for a severe collapse of property prices with a hard warning looming as a likely risk. Well, sorry, the OECD report didn't say that, and that certainly wasn't their intent. Here's another headline. Quite often, the journalists who write these screaming negatives, it's often the usual suspects. The same names keep popping up. One that does in News Limited, news.com.au, is a guy called Frank Chung. He doesn't seem able to write anything fair, balanced or reasonable about the property market. So his headline says, OECD warns Australia to prepare contingency plans for a severe collapse in the housing market. Severe collapse in the housing market could lead to a crisis situation in one or more financial institutions. That, he searched through a report full of positives and dragged out a negative and then misrepresented it to try and create a headline. It's pretty sad, but what they do. But even his report notes that what the OECD said was that the current trajectory of house price declines would suggest a soft landing. It also says a direct hit to the financial sector from a wave of mortgage defaults is unlikely. So that's the content of the report, but the treatment by various journalists and media outlets with their headlines. Here's another headline that says, prepare for severe housing collapse. Australian regulators have been warned to prepare contingency plans for a severe collapse in the housing market, which could lead to a crisis situation. Well, sorry, but the OECD report doesn't say that. Here's another report, and another one of the usual suspects who, whenever he turns his hand to writing about the real estate markets, is always sensationally negative, and that's Shane Wright, who writes for the Fairfax media empire. And his headline says, the OECD has its eye on Australia's property market and it's worried. Well, not in my reading of the report. It's a very, very calm and benign commentary on the Australian property market. And here's another headline that says, OECD says Australia should plan for worst case scenario of housing market crash. Yeah, outrageous beat up, hard landing. Here screams another headline here, OECD warning. Well, that's not what they said. That's not what they intended. And here is what they actually said. The property market has started to cool over the last year with prices falling in Sydney and Melbourne. So far, the data points to a soft landing without substantial consequence for the overall economy. So that's their summary of what they think. So how then did the media manage to come up with this completely different interpretation and these really loud, screaming negative headlines? Well, because they're unethical and they're not interested in truth or balance or fairness, and they're not interested in informing the Australian public, their customers. They're simply interested in creating headlines and sensation. Somehow they seem to imagine that they benefit from it. But yeah. Just to finish off with just another instance of the way media thinks and the way it does things. There's lots of positives out there about the property market. We have, for example, high levels of housing affordability at the moment. We have first home buyers most active that they've been any time in the last 8 years. First home buyers particularly active, making up an increasingly large share of purchases and loans in the housing industry at the moment. Renovations activity is at record highs. There's just a whole series of positives you could be writing about. And one came out this week, which was the latest lending figures, which surprised a few people because in October, the latest month for which we have figures, there was an increase in residential property lending. There was about $30 billion worth of mortgages written in October. Now, media has been telling us about this as credit crunch and no one can get a loan anymore. Well, clearly that's not right because $30 billion worth of mortgages were written in October, which is an increase of 2.2% over September. And for owner-occupier loans, they were up 3.5% in the month. So that's a pretty big increase and that's a pretty positive outcome. So what did this report write? The headline said, shock housing market data released. Really? And the article began by saying, despite dire predictions this week of a looming collapse in the property market, which would trigger economic disaster, new figures show a lift in the number of recent home buyers. So they managed to take this strong positive, the uplift in lending, against the trend of media rhetoric, and turn it into a screaming negative by introducing something that had nothing to do with the figures they're representing, a complete furphy, which I think the journalist probably made up. I haven't actually seen, and because we research the market and the media every day looking for information about real estate markets, I haven't seen any dire predictions about a looming collapse in the property market, not even in our rabid media, triggering economic disaster. I think they probably made it up. I mean, journalists do that, and but rather than just write the facts, here's something positive. I mean, some journalists just can't write positive. They have to somehow turn it into a negative, and in this case, that's how they did it. It's sad, but that's the way they behave. Don't ask me why. That's it for now. Let's do it again same time next week.